Let's turn our attention to now a very well-known culture from Mesoamerica, the Maya. As I mentioned before, the Maya are still a people that exist today, so we shouldn't forget that. They're not just archaeological, they're people and they haven't disappeared entirely, but there was a rise and a florescence and an expansion of the state level identity of this group of people, and then there was eventually a collapse and of this particular aspect of culture, and then the sort of decline of their dominance of the area. And it's an extremely long-lived culture. And we've already seen that there were rising and falling of the Olmec and the Zapotec and Teotihuacan, the city, and the Maya were existing throughout this time. So these people were in mainly the Yucatan, but also into Guatemala and a little bit into El Salvador and Belize. And a tiny bit into Honduras as well. And so these people were existing in this area for the from about 2000 BC, and maybe even before 2000 BC, as foraging, hunting and gathering, foraging groups. And but from about 2000 BC, there's evidence for these people starting to settle down and farm in permanent settlements. So this is the Neolithization process to sedentism and the production of domesticated foods. And then you see a progression of social changes on this basis, so this economic basis of sedentary agriculturalism. In the early period, it seems as though the location and the type of economy they had was in tropical rainforests in the south of this area, and the cities developed upon rivers and swamps. And actually, the source of water is extremely important in this part of the world. It may seem it's a rainforest, and so that you may think that there's a lot of water around, but there's lowlands, and there's a lot of brackish water, and there's sometimes difficult to get fresh water for crops and for drinking, and that sort of a thing. So in the early period, the cities were growing up on rivers and swamp areas where fresh water was available. In the later period, it seems like the center of the culture shifted to the north of the Yucatan Peninsula in the flat scrublands. And their sources of water were what are called cenotes, which are like sinkholes that have filled with fresh water, capturing rainwater that is in these sort of wells, these naturally occurring wells called cenotes. And so I'll ask you to know and study the timeline of this, and which includes what we call the classical period. So there's the early, middle, and late pre-classical period, the early and late classical, also the terminal classical, and then the post-classical. And this is a very 19th century and early 20th century way of dividing things up into before, during, and afters, the tripartite things. But it is the terminology that we use to describe these periods. And so we see that cities started to arise or up in the middle pre-classical period, and settlement coalesced around. They were small settlements. They weren't quite cities just yet. And the site of Sebal, about 950 BC, the settlements arose around ceremonial centers. And so we saw this already with the Olmec, if you recall, that we don't have a lot of information about their residences, but we do have their ceremonial centers. That's actually not too far away. And so the Maya had these ceremonial centers. And it seems like the populations, the inhabitations, were centered around these. And it wasn't until the Classic period, about 250 to about 900 AD, that the residential population started to rise to urban proportions, up to about 20,000 people. And in these, you start to see the familiar public monumental works like pyramids, very steep-sided pyramids especially. You also have royal residences, and you also have open plazas for communal activities, including ball courts, which we've seen before in terms of ritual and public competition. That may be described as competitive violence, in fact. And eventually we see these larger cities abandoned about AD 900, and a lot of this was lost to science and archaeology because once the cities were abandoned, the forest just took over and it's now covered mostly with dense overgrowth and needed to be rediscovered by science. And sometimes it's hard to penetrate these very dense rainforests. Things like LIDAR are inventions that allow us to scan through this canopy forest to see what's beneath. And that's helping us to understand a little bit more about the Yucatan and the Mayan settlements. So some of the cities, one of which famous in Honduras is the city of Copan, a large city with 2 pyramids. And the northern of these 2 pyramids has a hieroglyphic stairway, which the hieroglyphs are the script, and so this was carvings of intelligible writings on going up the stairway. Also at Copan there's an elaborate ball court that exists as well. So public works and monumental works concentrating on an elite hierarchical stratified society in Maya. So we see this happen building. And the Mayans were known for going all out on pyramid building. The new rulers, as a new ruler rose to power, they would just tear down an old pyramid and build a new one, or build over another new one, or refurbish one. And so they were trying to establish their power, their dominance, by erasing what came before them, and putting in their symbols of power, that I am now the big shot. I call the shots around here. And so the governmental organization in the Maya we describe as dynastic rule. And so these are hereditary titles that are passed down. For example, in Tikal, about AD 100, they actually set their calendar to the rule of who was the ruler in this dynasty. So their calendars were tied to the people that were in charge. And this wasn't coming from out of nowhere. As I've mentioned before, there's a lot of overlap of cultures. Teotihuacan had predated this, or was actually overlapping with some of these And so the Maya rulers were influenced by what was happening up there in Mexican highlands, and so they were influenced by the power being established by some of these rulers in Teotihuacan. Although we've talked a little bit about how there was competitive strategies for governmental organization at Teotihuacan, and the Mayan rulers actually were able to establish this power a little bit more solidly and they held power for centuries in these dynastic paradigms. So they would one ruler would say, "I'm in charge," and then this title is now passed on to my succession of rulers. And part of this was because they were regarded as sacred individuals that were identified with the temples themselves. And so you were building monuments not just to the idea of the state, as you might have been doing in some instances at Teotihuacan. You were building a temple, a pyramid, to an individual that was identified as a sacred individual. And so part of your identifying with the state was identifying with that person who's in charge of the state. But there were limits to that. In the classical period, we have some evidence that these rulers did not have absolute power. They did have limitations to how strongly they could hold grip on people, their citizenry. But there was evidence of inequality that we didn't see at places like at Teotihuacan and elsewhere. The grave goods in royal burials are far more elaborate and high status than what you find in just the common burials. For instance, at El Peruhuaca, you see grave goods in royal burials that are extremely high status, but they're not necessarily overly elaborate, and this could be down to the preservation issues, that we're not recovering everything that was left behind. But we also have evidence for Mayan households. So we don't just have elite residences and burials. We don't just have ceremonial centers and pyramids. We also have households. In Guatemala, the site of Aguateca is where we're fortunate to have recovered what was burned down. And this is sort of a snapshot of what was taking place in just a common everyday household site. And one of which was someone who had division of labor. We've talked about this before in terms of state level organization, that not everybody's a farmer, not everybody's a warrior. Some people have to do the organization. Somebody has to be a bureaucrat. And one of the households that was burned down at Aguateca was a scribe. This is a bureaucrat, somebody who takes notes and records things. This was probably a pretty important and powerful position, not a ruler, but actually somebody that was sort of in charge of stuff. Also maybe a little bit of an elite in themselves. The scribe's house has things like ink pots and pigmentation for painting and drawing, and also some evidence of weaving as well, spindle whorls and needles and things like that. So I have another lecture on writing and its purpose in state level society, so I'm not going to go too much into that right now, but I'll just point out that a major concern of the Maya was timekeeping. And so although there are some pictographs for concepts and speech and language and that sort of a thing, also for things like ideological purposes like artistic depictions, which we're going to look at in just a little bit here. Some of them were also for calendrical recording. That the earliest calendars that we know of are from the Olmec period and from Tres Zapotes in 300 BC. But there were a lot of calendars around there, and the Mayan tried to sort of bring them all together, and they have interlocking calendars that try and sort of make sense of the different phases of the moon and the stars and the sun. Some are the one of which is a 260-day ritual calendar. One is the 365-day solar calendar that we use today. There's a couple other systems. There's even a long count which looks at stars over thousands of years and their movements through the skies. And what the Mayans were able to do with their writing and their symbolism was to sort of fuse a lot of these calendars together to try and make them agree and have more precision in their timekeeping. Also, scribes were and artists were involved in forming and perpetuating mythology and religious ideas and stories that help a community, a complex and multifaceted community, have cohesion. How does a state hang together? Well, they've all are focusing on similar sorts of ideas. One of which was the mythology of the Popol Vuh, which illustrates the historic struggle of a couple of deities, twins, that they were to become the sun and the moon they were competing to become the sun and the moon by winning a ball game to the death against the lords of the underworld. And so these twins wanted to become the sun and the moon, and they were competing with the lords of the underworld to become that. And of course, we find at places like San Bartolo, we have murals that have that are painted with parallel stories to the Popol Vuh between about 100 BC and 100 AD. This site of San Bartolo in Guatemala has been dated. And this is found in a pyramid. We also see that these ideologies and these myths penetrate into the rituals that people do in their lives as well. So things like ritualistic ball games that these heroes in the twins heroes in the Popol Vuh. This is replicated in ball games played by real people in real life, and because this was played to the death in the myth of the twins. Some archaeologists believe that this was actually replicated as a to-the-death ball game in real life in Mayan cities. Also, some of the mythology involves things like bloodletting, and the ruler and their wife are involved in bloodletting ceremonies, and sacrifices are also integrated into some of their belief systems. And so when cities were conquered, they were burned, and captives were tortured and killed as part of this ritualistic, violent belief system. The Maya began to collapse in about 870 AD. The lowland cities in the south shows evidence for construction being halted and cities becoming deserted eventually. And there's some discussion as to why this took place. There's, of course, the inevitable discussion of environmental factors like intensification of agriculture to support these larger cities could have actually led to a lack of resiliency to adapt when things like reduced rainfall and short-term instability in the climate took place. Basically, they were overloading their environment, and if anything went wrong, the city just couldn't adapt to it, and so you become over-invested in one method, and then if that fails, then you don't really have many other options. But of course, internal cycles of violence between nobility and rulers of different cities, and even within the cities, led to warfare that probably took advantage of any weakness that what existed maybe in the economy or that was brought on by environmental factors. All right, that's all I have to say about the Maya. And then we'll come back and we'll talk about the Aztecs. I'll see you then.